I was told to be out of my own home by Friday, and I was standing there holding a bag of groceries when I realized they had already started erasing me. Melissa didn't raise her voice when she said it. That was what made it worse. "You'll be out by Friday, Eleanor," she said, standing by the kitchen island like she was discussing a grocery list. I hadn't even taken off my coat yet. The plastic bag in my hand sagged under the weight of a gallon of milk, a loaf of Wonder Bread, and a small container of chicken salad from Kroger. I set it down slowly on the counter, the kind with the worn laminate edge my husband, Frank, had installed himself back in 1992. "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my voice even. "What did you just say?" Melissa didn't look surprised that I asked. She had that same composed expression she always wore at church potlucks and PDA meetings. Polite, controlled, practiced. "We've been meaning to talk to you," she replied, folding her hands neatly. "This house is too much for you now. It's time to make a change." I glanced toward the living room, where Daniel was sitting on the couch, remote in hand, watching a muted baseball game. Cleveland was losing again. He didn't turn around. Not right away. When he finally did, he gave me a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mom," he said, "it's just practical." Practical. I repeated the word in my head as I reached for the milk and placed it carefully in the refrigerator. The hum of it sounded louder than usual. "And when exactly do we decide this?" I asked, closing the fridge door with a soft push. Melissa stepped forward slightly, as if she had been waiting for that question. "We've been looking at some lovely senior communities just outside Columbus," she said. "They have walking paths, social activities, everything you'd need. We already spoke with someone. There's an opening. Already spoke with someone." I let that settle for a moment. I moved to the sink, rinsed my hands under warm water, and dried them on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. Small, steady motions. Things I could control. "Melissa," I said, turning to face her, "this is my home." She tilted her head, just slightly. "It was Frank's home," she corrected gently. "And now it's Daniel's responsibility to manage things properly." That was the first time something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that I felt it. A quiet adjustment, like a lock clicking into place. I looked at Daniel again. "Is that how you see it?" He hesitated, just for a second, then nodded. "We're trying to help you, Mom." Help. I walked past them both without another word and headed down the hallway toward my bedroom. My shoes sounded too loud against the hardwood floor. Each step felt measured, deliberate. When I reached the door, I pushed it open and stopped. The room was almost empty. The quilt I had made 20 years ago was gone from the bed. The dresser Frank built in our garage was missing. The closet doors stood open, hangers bare, swaying slightly like someone had just been there moments ago. Along the far wall, stacked neatly, were cardboard boxes. Brown, uniform, labeled in black marker. Winter clothes, old photos, papers. I stepped inside slowly. My hand brushed the edge of one box, then another. I crouched down and opened the one marked photos. Inside were frames wrapped in newspaper, albums I hadn't touched in years, and on top, face down, was a picture of Frank in his army uniform, taken the year we met. I turned it over carefully. The glass was intact. That surprised me. Behind me, I heard Melissa's footsteps in the hallway. "We started packing to make things easier for you," she said. "Easier?" I kept my eyes on the photograph. "You started packing without asking me. We didn't want to overwhelm you," she replied, her tone still calm, still reasonable. I stood up, holding the frame in both hands. "And the rest of my things?" I asked. "Furniture, documents, where are they?" There was a pause, just long enough to matter. When I turned around, Melissa's expression hadn't changed, but something in her eyes had. Not uncertainty. Calculation. "Some of it is already in storage," she said. "And some paperwork has been taken care of." Taken care of. I felt that phrase settle heavier than anything else she'd said. I looked past her, down the hallway, toward the front of the house. The place I had lived in for nearly 40 years suddenly felt unfamiliar, like I had stepped into someone else's version of it. And for the first time since I walked through the door, a single, clear question formed in my mind, one that refused to go away. What exactly had they already done, without me knowing? I set the photo back into the box more carefully than I needed to, aligning the edges as if that small act could restore some order to what had just been undone. Then I stood there for a moment listening to the house, really listening, and that was when I noticed something else was missing, not furniture this time, but a sound, the faint mechanical hum from the hallway cabinet where Frank had always kept the old safe, a low, steady vibration that I had stopped hearing years ago because it had become part of the background of my life, and now it was gone. I walked past Melissa without asking permission and moved down the hall, my hand trailing lightly along the wall until I reached the narrow closet beside the linen cabinet. I opened the door, and the metal safe was still there, bolted into the floor, just like Frank had insisted, but the keypad was dark, completely unlit. I pressed a button, nothing happened. I pressed another, still nothing. Then I crouched down and noticed the battery compartment hanging slightly open, one screw missing, like someone had been in a hurry. The batteries must have died, Melissa said from behind me, her voice calm, but a little too quick, and I turned just enough to look at her over my shoulder. That safe has not died in 30 years, I replied, standing up slowly. Frank changed those batteries every Christmas whether they needed it or not. She gave a small shrug, the kind that tries to close a conversation before it opens. Things were out, Eleanor, but I did not answer her. Instead, I walked past her again, back toward the kitchen, because now there was a different kind of pressure building, not loud, not panicked, but focused like something narrowing into place. I reached for the phone on the wall, the old landline we had kept even after everyone else switched to cell phones, and I picked up the receiver, the dial toned steady and familiar. "Who are you calling?" Daniel asked, finally setting the remote down and standing up, his voice carrying a note of concern that had been missing earlier. I met his eyes for the first time since I walked in. "I'm calling Mr. Halpern," I said, and that got a reaction, not dramatic, but real. Daniel's shoulders stiffened just slightly. "Mom, that is not necessary," he said, taking a step closer. "We are just trying to make things easier." I held the receiver in my hand without dialing yet, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. "Then you'll not mind if I ask a few questions," I said, and Melissa moved then, crossing the kitchen floor with measured steps. "Eleanor, legal matters can get complicated, and we have already taken care of most of that for you," she said. And there was again that phrase, taken care of, like I was a problem to be managed instead of a person who had lived in this house longer than either of them had known each other. I turned slightly, enough that I could see both of them at once. "What exactly have you taken care of?" I asked, my voice steady, and for a brief second neither of them answered. Daniel looked at Melissa. Melissa looked back at him, a silent exchange that told me more than any explanation would have. Then Daniel cleared his throat. "Just paperwork, Mom, routine stuff," he said. "Utilities, property tax planning, things like that." I nodded once slowly as if I accepted that answer. Then I placed the receiver back into its cradle without making the call. Not yet, because something about this was unfolding too quickly, and I wanted to see how far they would go if they believed I was not pushing back. "All right," I said, reaching for the grocery bag again and pulling out the chicken salad, setting it neatly in the refrigerator beside the milk. "Then we will talk about it tomorrow." Melissa seemed relieved by that. "Just for a moment, that sounds reasonable," she said, and Daniel exhaled quietly, like he had been holding his breath. I closed the refrigerator door and turned back toward the hallway, my eyes drifting once more to the closet where the safe sat silent and open to interference, and then to the stack of boxes in my room beyond it, each one labeled in handwriting that was not mine. And as I walked back toward my bedroom, one thought settled in with a clarity I could not ignore. If they'd already gone through my safe, then whatever they called paperwork was no longer just routine, and I needed to find out exactly which documents were no longer where I had left them before Friday came. I did not open another box right away. Instead, I stood in the middle of what used to be my bedroom and let my eyes adjust to the emptiness, the way you do when the lights go out unexpectedly and you need a moment to understand where everything is gone. The indentation on the carpet where my dresser used to sit was still visible, a faint outline like a memory that refused to disappear, and for a second I could almost see it there again. Frank leaning against it on a Sunday morning, tying his tie before church, asking me if the blue one looked too formal. I stepped forward and ran my fingers over that spot, then turned toward the remaining boxes and chose one labeled papers, lifting the flaps carefully. Inside were folders, envelopes, and a few loose documents that had not been sorted with the same care as the photos. I knelt down and began going through them one by one, my movement steady, deliberate, because this was no longer about emotion alone. This was about understanding. Halfway through the stack, I found something that did not belong there, a manila envelope with a printed return address from a title company in Columbus, dated 3 weeks ago. I did not remember receiving it. I slid the document out and unfolded it, the paper crisp, the ink still dark, and there was my name typed clearly at the top alongside Daniel's, a preliminary transfer document outlining a potential change in property ownership. I read the first paragraph twice, then a third time, just to be certain I was not misunderstanding what I was seeing. "Melissa," I called out, not loudly, but with enough clarity that it carried down the hallway. Her footsteps came a few seconds later. Measured as always, she stopped at the doorway, arms loosely crossed. "Yes," she said, and I held the document up slightly. "When were you planning to tell me about this?" I asked. She glanced at the paper, then back at me, her expression barely shifting. "That is just a draft," she replied. "Nothing has been finalized." I tilted my head slightly, studying her. "A draft that I never saw, never signed, and somehow ended up in my room, packed into a box labeled as if it were already history," I said, and this time there was a flicker in her eyes, quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Behind her, Daniel appeared again, slower this time, like he was weighing whether to step into the conversation or stay out of it. "Mom, it is just planning," he said. "We're trying to make sure everything is set up the right way." I lowered the document to my lap and looked at him directly. "The right way for whom?" I asked, and he hesitated. Not long, but long enough to answer the question without speaking. I set the envelope aside and reached back into the box, pulling out another folder, this one thinner, labeled in handwriting I did not recognize. Inside were copies of utility statements, property tax notices, and something else, a printed confirmation email from a moving company scheduled for Friday morning at 9 o'clock. Full packing service included, destination listed as temporary storage facility. I let out a slow breath, not because I was overwhelmed, but because the shape of this was becoming clearer with each piece I uncovered. "You already booked movers," I said, holding the paper up so both of them could see it. Melissa stepped forward this time, closing some of the distance between us. "We had to secure a date," she said. "These things fill up quickly." Her tone remained calm, almost helpful, but the words landed differently now, each one fitting into a pattern that no longer looked accidental. I thought back to small moments over the past few months. Melissa asking casually where Frank kept important documents, Daniel mentioning property taxes in a way that felt rehearsed, the garage keypad being changed, and me telling myself each time that it was nothing, just normal adjustments in a shared home. And I realized then that the shift had not happened all at once. It had been built quietly, step by step, until today, when the result was sitting in front of me, in brown cardboard boxes. I stood up slowly, brushing my hand against my slacks, and picked up the manila envelope again. "I'm going to hold on to this," I said, not asking for permission. And for the first time, neither of them tried to stop me. Melissa simply nodded once tight and controlled. Daniel looked down at the floor. I walked past them, out into the hallway, the document held firmly in my hand. And as I reached the end of the corridor, I paused because something else came back to me. Something small but sharp, a conversation I had overheard just last week when Melissa was on the phone in the backyard. Her voice low but urgent. "We can close next week if everything is in place," she had said, and at the time I had not thought much of it. But now, standing there with proof in my hand and a moving date already scheduled, that sentence felt different, heavier, like a piece of a puzzle I had only just begun to see, and the question that followed was no longer quiet or uncertain. It was precise, and it demanded an answer. What exactly were they planning to close next week? And had they already set it in motion without me? I did not go to the front door or the kitchen this time. Instead, I turned left toward the small home office Daniel and Melissa had set up in what used to be our guest room. The door was halfway open, and I could see the edge of a desk, a laptop still glowing faintly on the surface, and a stack of neatly arranged folders beside it. I paused just long enough to listen. The house had gone quiet behind me. No footsteps, no voices, just the low hum of the air vent and the distant sound of a car passing on Maple Street outside. Then I stepped inside and closed the door gently behind me. The room smelled faintly of printer ink and lemon cleaner. Everything in its place, too orderly, the kind of order that comes from intention, not habit. I moved to the desk and glanced at the laptop screen. It had gone to sleep, but not shut down. I tapped the spacebar lightly, and the screen woke up without asking for a password, which told me more than I needed to know. An email inbox opened in front of me, Melissa's name at the top, and I scrolled just enough to see a subject line that made my hand stop. Closing confirmation, Whitmore property, dated yesterday afternoon. I clicked it. The message was from a title officer, formal, polite, confirming that all preliminary documents had been received and that closing was scheduled for next Thursday at 10 o'clock in the morning, Columbus time, with a list of required signatures already marked as completed in advance. My eyes moved down the page slowly, taking in each line, each detail, until I reached the attachment, a scanned document. And when I opened it, I felt something inside me settle into a cold, precise shape. It was a deed transfer, not a draft, not a proposal, but a finalized document, stamped and notarized with my name printed clearly at the top and a signature at the bottom that was meant to be mine. I leaned closer to the screen, studying it. The curve of the letters, the way the E in Eleanor had been formed, it looked almost right, almost convincing, but not quite. The stroke was heavier, the spacing slightly off, like someone had practiced it but never lived with it. You should not be in here. Melissa's voice came from behind me, closer than I expected, and I did not jump. I simply straightened and turned to face her, the laptop still open between us. Then you should have locked it, I said, my tone even, and for the first time since this began, she did not immediately respond. Daniel appeared a second later, standing just behind her, his expression tight, uncertain. Mom, what are you doing? He asked, and I gestured lightly toward the screen. I am reading about the sale of my house, I replied. Melissa stepped forward, her posture still controlled, but her eyes sharper now. It is not your house anymore in the way you think, she said. And that was new. Not the soft phrasing from before, not the careful suggestions, but something closer to a statement of fact. I turned back to the screen and tapped the document again, enlarging the signature. This is not my handwriting, I said, not as an accusation, but as a conclusion. And the silence that followed confirmed it more clearly than any answer could have. Daniel shifted his weight, running a hand through his hair. Mom, it is just a formality. We were going to explain everything, he said, his voice lower now, almost pleading. And I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the boy he used to be layered over the man standing in front of me. And for a moment there was something like regret in his eyes, but it was already too late for that to matter. I reached forward and picked up one of the folders from the desk, flipping it open. Inside were printed copies of the same document, along with a cashier's check stub made out to Daniel for a deposit amount that made my breath pause for just a fraction of a second. $125,000, dated 2 days ago. I held it up between my fingers. You have already taken money for this, I said, and this time Melissa did not deny it. She met my gaze directly. We made a decision, she said, because you would not. And there was the truth, not hidden behind soft language anymore. I set the folder back down carefully, closed the laptop with a quiet click, and adjusted the sleeve of my cardigan, as if we were discussing something ordinary. You scheduled a closing next Thursday, I said. You booked movers for Friday, and you signed my name on documents that do not belong to you. I took a small step closer to them, not aggressive, just enough to shift the space. That is not planning, Melissa, I added, my voice steady. That is something else entirely. Neither of them spoke. And in that silence, something changed, not in them, but in me. The uncertainty that had followed me down the hallway was gone, replaced by something clearer, more focused, like a line drawn where there had only been blur before. I turned toward the door, the envelope still in my hand, and as I reached for the handle, I spoke without looking back. I'm going to make one phone call, I said, and after that, we're going to have a very different conversation. I opened the door and stepped in the hallway, already knowing exactly who I was calling and what I needed to ask, because if they believed this was already finished, then they had made one mistake they could not undo. And I was about to find out just how much of this was still legally mine. I did not rush the call. I walked into the kitchen, set the manila envelope down beside the phone, and took a moment to steady my hands before picking up the receiver, because panic would not help me now, precision would. I dialed Mr. Halpern's number from memory, each digit deliberate, and when his assistant answered, I said, "This is Eleanor Whitmore. I need to speak with him as soon as possible." My voice calm enough that she did not ask questions, just placed me on hold, the soft instrumental music filling the silence for a few seconds before his voice came on the line, older now, but still sharp. "Eleanor, is everything all right?" I glanced toward the hallway where Melissa and Daniel were no longer visible, but I knew they were listening for something, waiting for me to react the way they expected. "I am not sure yet," I said, "but I need you to tell me one thing clearly. Is my house still legally mine?" There was a pause on the other end, paper shuffling, a keyboard clicking, then his voice again, more focused, as of the last filed deed. "Yes, it is," he said. "What?" I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, but I did not relax, not yet. "Then I will be in your office this afternoon," I said, "and I will bring documents that you need to see." He did not hesitate. "Come in at 2 o'clock. I will clear my schedule." I hung up the phone gently and stood there for a moment, letting that answer settle into something solid inside me, something I could build on. When I turned, Melissa was already in the doorway, her expression no longer softened by politeness. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," she said, and I picked up the envelope without responding right away, sliding it under my arm. "It is already complicated," I replied. "You just hoped I would not notice." Daniel stepped in behind her, his voice tighter now. "Mom, you cannot just go around undoing things we have already set in motion," he said, and there it was again. That assumption that this was already finished. I met his eyes steadily. "Watch me," I said, not raising my voice, not needing to. Melissa crossed her arms, shifting her weight slightly. "The closing is scheduled," she said. "The buyers have already wired a deposit. If you interfere now, there will be consequences." That was new. Not just control, but pressure, external, financial, real. I nodded once, acknowledging it without accepting it. "Then we will all have to deal with those consequences," I said, and moved past them toward the front door. I grabbed my coat from the hook, slipped it on, and reached for my purse, the one I had carried for years, the leather-worn but still sturdy. Inside were my keys, my wallet, and now the envelope that mattered more than anything else in this house. As I stepped onto the porch, the late afternoon air felt colder than it had earlier, a sharp wind moving through the trees lining the street. I locked the door behind me out of habit, then paused, realizing something that made me turn the key again, this time more deliberately, listening for the click, because if they were willing to go this far with paperwork, I could not assume anything else in this house was untouched. I walked down the driveway toward my car, a silver sedan Frank had insisted we keep well maintained, and as I reached for the door handle, my phone rang inside my purse. The sound sudden and sharp. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen, the number unfamiliar, but the area code local. I answered it anyway. "Hello." There was a brief pause, then a man's voice, professional, direct. "Mrs. Whitmore? This is Jason Keller from Keller & Associates Realty. I am calling to confirm your attendance at the closing next Thursday." I stopped beside the car, the wind catching the edge of my coat. "I think you have the wrong person," I said, and there was a small hesitation on his end. "According to our records, you have already signed the transfer documents," he replied. "We just need you present to finalize everything." I looked back at the house, at the windows that had once felt like mine, and tightened my grip on the phone. "Then your records are wrong," I said, my voice steady, "because I have not agreed to sell anything." There was another pause, longer this time. "In that case," he said carefully, "we may have a problem." I ended the call without another word and stood there for a moment, the reality of it settling in deeper than before. This was no longer contained within my family. It had moved beyond that, into contracts, money, and people who believed this transaction was real. And as I got into the car and started the engine, one question pressed forward with a clarity I could not ignore. If the buyers thought they already had my house, then how many other people had been told the same story? And what exactly had Melissa promised them in my name? I kept both hands on the steering wheel longer than necessary, letting the engine idle in the driveway, as the weight of that call settled into something sharper than fear, something closer to calculation. Because for the first time since I walked into that empty room, I was no longer guessing. I had confirmation that this had already moved beyond private conversations and into formal transactions. and that meant there would be a trail. I shifted the car into reverse, pulled out slowly, and headed toward Main Street. The late afternoon traffic light, but steady. People going about their ordinary routines, stopping at red lights, turning into grocery store parking lots, unaware that just a few blocks away, someone was trying to sell a house that did not belong to them. As I drove, I replayed Jason Keller's words in my mind. Not the tone, but the details. Closing next Thursday, deposit already wired, documents marked as signed, and one phrase in particular stood out, according to. Our records, because records meant files, files meant copies, and copies meant evidence that could be traced. I reached a red light near the gas station on Elm and made a decision. Not the kind that feels dramatic, but the kind that settles quietly in a place and does not move. I would not go straight to Mr. Halpern's office yet, not before I saw exactly what those records looked like from the outside. I made a right turn instead of going straight, heading toward the small brick building where Keller & Associates Realty had been for as long as I could remember, a modest sign out front, a row of American flags along the sidewalk, and a glass door with business hours printed in white lettering. I parked across the street, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, watching people move in and out, a young couple laughing as they stepped inside, a man in a suit talking on his phone near the entrance, everything about it normal. Professional, legitimate, which made it all the more important that I walk in without revealing more than I needed to. I checked my reflection briefly in the rearview mirror, smoothed my hair back into place, and stepped out of the car, crossing the street at a steady pace. When I opened the door, a small bell chimed overhead, and the scent of fresh coffee and paper filled the space. A receptionist looked up from behind the front desk and smiled politely. "Good afternoon. How can I help you?" she asked, and I returned the smile, just enough to keep the interaction simple. "I am here to ask about a property listed under my name," I said, placing my purse on the counter lightly. "Eleanor Whitmore." Her fingers moved across the keyboard, quick and practiced, and after a few seconds, her expression shifted, not alarmed, but attentive. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore, we have a file here," she said, turning the monitor slightly as if to confirm. "You are scheduled for closing next Thursday." I nodded once, as though I expected that answer. "Could you print a copy of the listing details for me?" I asked, keeping my tone even. She hesitated for just a second, then clicked a few more keys. "Of course," she said, and the printer behind her began to hum. While it worked, I glanced around the office, framed photos of sold homes on the walls, certificates, awards, everything reinforcing the idea that this was a place built on trust. And yet somewhere in their system was a version of my life that had been altered without my consent. The printer stopped, and she handed me a small stack of papers. "Here you go," she said, and I took them, flipping through quickly the listing price, the square footage, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, updated kitchen, and then I saw it, a section labeled seller authorization, with a digital signature attached, my name typed beneath it, along with a timestamp from 4 days ago. "Everything look correct?" she asked, and I met her eyes, holding the paper steady. "It looks very detailed," I said, which was the truth, just not the whole truth. I thanked her, gathered the documents, and walked back out into the afternoon light, the door closing behind me with a soft click, and as I stood on the sidewalk, reading through the pages more carefully now, one more detail emerged that shifted everything again, a note at the bottom indicating that all seller communications have been handled through a secondary email address, one that was not mine but was listed under my name anyway. I folded the papers slowly and slipped them in my purse, the shape of what needed to happen next becoming clearer with each piece of evidence I gathered, because this was no longer just about stopping a sale. It was about proving how it had been done. And as I walked back toward my car, one thought settled in with quiet certainty. If Melissa had created a false identity in my name to move this forward, then she had left behind something even more valuable than a forged signature, and I intended to find it before anyone realized I was looking. I did not drive straight to Mr. Halpern's office after leaving the realty building. Instead, I pulled into the parking lot of a small strip mall 2 blocks away, parked near a dry cleaner, and turned off the engine again, because now I had something I had not had before, proof that extended beyond my house, beyond my family, in a systems that kept records and timestamps and digital trails. I took the printed listing documents out of my purse and spread them across the passenger seat, smoothing each page flat with my hand, reading line by line more carefully this time. And there. It was again that secondary email address listed under my name, something like whitmore.property@gmail.com. Melto, ewhitmore.property@gmail.com. Clean, simple, believable enough that no one would question at a glance. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, opened my contacts, and scrolled until I found the number I was looking for. Not Mr. Halpern this time, but someone else, someone I had not spoken to in over a year. "Mark, it is Eleanor Whitmore," I said when he answered. And there was a brief pause before recognition came through his voice. "Mrs. Whitmore? It has been a while. How are you?" Mark Benson had helped Frank set up our email accounts years ago. Back when everything started moving online and Frank insisted we keep things organized. "I need a favor," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "I need to know if someone can create an email address in my name without me knowing, and what kind of trace that would leave." There was a shift in his tone, more focused now. "It happens more often than people think," he said, "but there is always a trail, IP logs, recovery emails, device history. Why?" I glanced at the papers again, at the printed confirmation tied to that address. "Because someone has been using one," I said, "and they have been signing documents with it." There was a pause, longer this time, and then he spoke more carefully. "If you can access that account, or even confirm it exists, I can help you trace where it was set up and what device it was used on." I nodded even though he could not see me. "Give me an hour," I said, and ended the call. I sat there for a moment, letting that sink in, because this was no longer just about a forged signature. It was about a constructed identity, something deliberate, something that required planning and access, and that meant whoever had done it had left behind more than they intended. I folded the papers back into my purse and started the car again, this time heading back toward the house, but not with the same uncertainty I'd left with earlier. Now I had a direction, something to look for, something specific. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always had. White siding, trimmed hedges, the small American flag still planted near the front steps, but no longer felt like a place I was returning to. It felt like a place I was entering with purpose. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the air inside warmer than outside, carrying the faint scent of whatever Melissa had cooked earlier, something with garlic and butter, and I could hear their voices in the living room. Low, controlled, stopping abruptly when they realized I was back. "That was quick," Melissa said as I stepped into view, her eyes scanning me briefly, as if trying to measure what I'd learned. "I forgot something," I replied simply, and set my purse down on the kitchen counter. Daniel stood up this time, not staying seated like before. "Mom, we need to talk about how you are handling this," he said, and I met his gaze steadily. "We will," I said, "just not yet." Then I turned and walked back down the hallway, past the silent safe, past the stacked boxes, and into the home office again, closing the door behind me with a soft click. The laptop was still there, still open, and this time I did not hesitate. I sat down in the chair, moved the mouse, and brought the screen back to life. The inbox still open, the same thread visible. I clicked on the account profile, scanning for any detail that could connect it to something real, something traceable. And then I saw it, a recovery email listed beneath the account settings, partially hidden but still visible enough to read, ending in @cartermail.com, a domain I recognized immediately because it was not generic. It was tied to Melissa's maiden name, Carter. I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting that detail settle into place, because that was the first direct link, not assumption, not inference, but a connection between the false identity and the person standing in my kitchen. I picked up my phone again and took a photo of the screen, clear, steady, making sure the email and the recovery detail were both visible. Then I stood up, slipping the phone back into my purse, and opened the office door. As I stepped into the hallway, Melissa was already there, waiting, her posture tighter now, less composed than before. "What are you doing in there?" she asked, and I looked at her for a moment, not answering right away, because for the first time since this began, I was no longer reacting. I was holding something she did not know I had, and that changed the balance in a way she could already feel. "I am starting to understand," I said finally, and walked past her toward the front of the house, leaving her standing there with a question she could not yet answer, because what I had just found did more than confirm my suspicions. It gave me a way to prove exactly who had been speaking in my name, and I knew exactly who I needed to show it to next. I did not go back into the kitchen right away. Instead, I slowed my pace just enough to make it look like I was thinking, not acting, because what I carried now mattered more than anything I'd said so far, and the last thing I needed was for Melissa to realize that I had already found the thread that tied everything together. When I stepped into the living room, Daniel was standing near the window, arms crossed, his posture tighter than before, while Melissa had moved to the dining table where a neat stack of papers sat beside her. Something new, something prepared, and that alone told me they were not waiting anymore. They were moving forward. "We were just about to call you in here," Melissa said, her tone smooth again, almost reassuring, but there was a firmness underneath it now, like a decision that had already been made. "Good," I replied, taking a seat at the end of the table, placing my purse beside my chair. "Then let us talk." She slid the top document toward me, turning it so it faced my direction. "This is a relocation agreement," she said. "It outlines your transition to the Maple Grove Senior Community. Move-in date is set for Monday. They have already reserved a unit for you." I glanced down at the paper without touching it. The letterhead crisp, the logo printed in soft blue, and below it, a typed summary of services, meal plans, transportation, all laid out like a brochure disguised as a contract. "You scheduled this without me," I said, not as a question, just as a statement. Melissa folded her hands lightly. "We had to secure availability," she replied, echoing the same reasoning she had used earlier with the movers, but this time it carried more weight, more finality. Daniel stepped forward slightly, resting his hand on the back of a chair. "Mom, it is a good place," he said. "We visited last week. It is clean, safe. They even have a nurse on staff 24 hours a day." I looked at him, really looked this time, and saw something new in his expression, not just discomfort, but justification, like he had already convinced himself this was the right thing. I nodded once slowly, then reached out and picked up the document, flipping through the pages with measured attention, each section labeled, each clause neatly structured, and then I saw it, a signature line at the bottom of the final page, my name printed beneath it, and above it, a faint digital imprint where a signature had already been placed. I let the page rest in my hands for a moment before looking up. "You have already signed this too," I said, and this time Melissa did not soften her response. "We expedited the process," she said, "because time matters now." There was no hesitation in her voice, no attempt to disguise the fact that she had crossed another line. I set the document back down carefully, aligning it with the stack as if I were organizing it for them. "And what happens if I do not go on Monday?" I asked, my tone even, and Daniel answered before Melissa could. "Then things get complicated," he said. "Financially, legally, it could affect the closing." There was again the closing, always tied to everything else, like the center of a wheel they had already set in motion. I leaned back slightly in my chair, folding my hand in my lap, not reacting the way they expected, not raising my voice, not refusing outright, just watching them, letting the silence stretch long enough that it began to press on them instead of me. Melissa shifted her weight just slightly, then leaned forward, placing her palm flat on the table. "Eleanor, we are trying to handle this responsibly," she said. "But if you delay this any further, it is not just inconvenient. It could cost us the entire deal." Her eyes held mine steadily now. No pretense left, just intent. I tilted my head just enough to acknowledge what she had revealed, because that was new. Not just control, not just planning, but dependence. Their plan was no longer self-contained. It was tied to outside money, outside timelines, outside expectations, and that meant pressure was building on their side as well. I reached for my purse, opened it slowly, and then paused, letting my hand rest just inside without taking anything out. "Not yet. You seem very certain that everything is already decided," I said, my voice calm, almost thoughtful, and Melissa met my gaze without blinking. "It is," she replied. I gave a small nod, then closed my purse and placed it back beside me, leaving the moment unresolved on purpose, because certainty, when it is built on something fragile, has a way of collapsing at the right time. I stood up from the table, smoothing the front of my cardigan, and walked toward the hallway again, not asking permission, not explaining, just moving with a steadiness that neither of them interrupted. And as I passed the office door, I let my fingers brush lightly against the frame, a small, almost invisible gesture that grounded me in what I already knew. Behind me, Melissa's voice followed, sharper now. Where are you going? And I did not turn around when I answered. To get ready, I said, and kept walking because they believed the next move was Monday. They believed I was being pushed into a corner, but what they did not understand yet was that I already had something that could stop their closing, unravel their documents, and turn their certainty into something very different. And I was about to decide exactly when to use it. I closed the bedroom door behind me with a soft click, not to shut them out, but to give myself a space where every movement could be deliberate, because what came next could not be rushed or improvised. I set my purse on the edge of the bed frame that was no longer there, the habit still stronger than the reality, then caught myself and placed it instead on one of the sealed boxes, the one labeled winter clothes, and opened it just enough to reach inside. Beneath a folded sweater, I kept a small blue tin, the kind that once held butter cookies, the lid slightly dented at one corner, and inside it were things I had not needed in years, spare keys, a copy of my driver's license from a decade ago, and most importantly, a thin stack of documents Frank had insisted we keep separate from everything else, just in case, he had said, back when everything in our lives still felt predictable. I lifted the tin out carefully and set it beside me, opening it fully this time, and there it was, the original deed copy, stamped, signed, and dated, not a scan, not a draft, but the physical record of ownership, along with a notarized letter Frank had written shortly before he passed, confirming that the house was to remain under my sole authority unless I chose otherwise. I ran my fingers lightly over the edge of that paper, not out of sentiment, but to remind myself that this was still real, still valid, still something no digital signature could replace. From the hallway, I could hear low voices again, Melissa and Daniel speaking just quietly enough that I could not make out the words. But the rhythm of it had changed, quicker now, more urgent, and that told me they felt the shift even if they did not understand it yet. I took out my phone and dialed. Mark again, I found the account, I said when he answered, keeping my voice low but steady. And I have a recovery email tied to a domain connected to Melissa Carter. There was no hesitation on his end this time. That is enough to start, he said. Send me whatever you have, screenshots, timestamps, anything. I can pull the login origin and confirm the device. I glanced at the office down the hall, where the laptop still sat open. Give me 15 minutes, I replied, and ended the call. I slid the deed and the letter back into the tin, closed the lid, and placed it back into the box exactly where it had been, covering it again with the sweater because that was not something I needed them to know about yet, not until the right moment. Then I stood, smoothed my hands against my slacks, and walked back into the hallway, my steps measured, my expression neutral, because what mattered now was not what I felt, but what they believed. When I entered the living room, both of them looked up at once, their conversation cutting off mid-sentence. Melissa straightened slightly. "Are you ready to talk about Monday?" she asked, and I met her gaze without hesitation. "Yes," I said, and that answer caught them off guard, just enough that I saw it register before they could hide it. Daniel stepped forward, relief flickering across his face. "So you were going to cooperate?" he asked, and I gave a small nod. Not too quick, not too eager, just enough. "I will be ready," I said, choosing my words carefully, because readiness and agreement were not the same thing. Melissa studied me for a moment longer than usual, as if trying to find something beneath the surface. Then she exhaled softly. "That is the best decision for everyone," she said, and turned back toward the table, already reaching for her phone, likely to confirm something, to move another piece into place. I watched her for a second, then turned toward the kitchen, picking up a glass and filling it with water. From a sink, taking a slow sip as if nothing had changed, as if I had accepted everything they had arranged. But inside, the pieces were aligning, the account, the forged signature, the recovery email, the scheduled closing, and now there's certainty that I was no longer resisting. I set the glass down gently and glanced toward the hallway once more, toward the office where the evidence still waited, and toward the front door beyond it, because in less than an hour, I would be sitting across from Mr. Halpern with documents they believed were untouchable, and the question was no longer whether I could stop them. It was how far I was willing to let them go before I did. I did not leave immediately. That was the first real decision I made after everything aligned, because walking out too quickly would have confirmed what Melissa was already beginning to suspect, and I needed one more piece before I stepped into Mr. Halpern's office. Instead, I stayed in the kitchen long enough to finish my glass of water, rinsed it, placed it carefully in the drying rack, and wiped the counter with the same dish towel, as if I were closing out an ordinary afternoon, the kind of small, visible routine that makes people lower their guard. From the dining room, I could hear Melissa on the phone, her voice controlled but faster now. "Yes, Thursday is still on schedule," she said, pausing briefly as if listening. "No, there will not be any delays." Another pause, then quieter. "She is cooperating." I stood still for just a second, letting those words settle into something useful, then reached for my purse and walked calmly toward the hallway. I did not go to the front door this time. I went back into the office, closing the door behind me more firmly than before, and moved straight to the laptop, waking the screen again. The inbox was still open, but I did not stay there. I clicked into the account settings, then into the sent folder, scrolling carefully, not rushing, because what I needed was not just proof of existence, but proof of action. And then I found it, a chain of emails between the false account and Keller and Associates, confirming, listing details, negotiating minor repairs, even agreeing to a final price adjustment 3 days ago, all written in a tone that tried to sound like me, polite, measured, slightly formal, but there were small tells, phrases I would never use, punctuation that felt forced. I took out my phone again and began taking photos, one screen at a time, making sure the timestamps were visible, the sender address clear, the message content intact. Then I clicked on another thread, this one labeled Buyer Communication, and opened it. Inside was a message from someone named Laura Jennings, thanking me for agreeing to leave certain furniture behind, including the oak dresser from the bedroom and the dining table that Frank and I had bought together 30 years ago. I stopped there for a moment, reading that line again, because this was no longer just about transferring property. They had already begun, dividing up what remained of my life inside it. "You said you were done in here." Melissa's voice came from just outside the door, sharper now, closer. I did not rush. I finished taking one more photo before closing the laptop slowly, deliberately, then turned the handle and opened the door. She was standing there, one hand on her hip, her patience thinner than it had been earlier. "What exactly are you doing?" she asked, and this time I answered her directly. "Preparing," I said, and stepped past her into the hallway. Daniel was already moving toward us from the living room, his expression tense. "Mom, this is getting out of hand," he said, and I stopped just long enough to face both of them. "No," I replied, my voice steady. "It is finally becoming clear." And for a moment, neither of them spoke because something in that answer did not fit the version of me they had been working with all day. I walked to the front door then, picked up my keys from the small ceramic bowl by the entryway, the one shaped like a maple leaf, and slipped them into my purse along with my phone and the printed document from the realty office. Melissa took a step closer, her voice lower now, more controlled again. "Eleanor, if you walk out right now and interfere with this process, you're going to make things very difficult for everyone," she said. And I turned to her, not with anger, not with hesitation, but with something she had not seen from me before. "That depends on what you mean by interfere," I said, and opened the door. The evening air hit cooler now, the light beginning to shift toward dusk, and as I stepped onto the porch, I could feel both of them watching me, waiting for something, a reaction, a hesitation, but I did not give them either. I walked down the steps, across the driveway, and into my car, placing my purse carefully on the passenger seat beside me. The documents inside it no longer just evidence, but leverage. When I started the engine, I did not look back at the house. Not this time, because the next conversation was not going to happen there. It was going to happen in an office where signatures mattered, where records could be challenged, and where the truth would not be something they could smooth over with. Careful words. As I pulled out onto the street and headed toward Mr. Halpern's building, one final detail settled into place in my mind, something I had seen in those emails that changed the stakes entirely. Because if the buyer had already been promised furniture, access, and a timeline, then they had been told far more than just the sale price. I was about to find out exactly how far Melissa had gone in my name before I walked through that office door. I pulled into the small parking lot beside Mr. Halpern's office just as the streetlights flickered on, the kind of quiet transition from day to evening that usually went unnoticed. But tonight it felt like a line being drawn, clear and final. I gathered my purse, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the brick building with a steadiness that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with clarity. because whatever happened next would no longer be contained inside my home. His assistant looked up as I entered, recognized me immediately, and stood. "Mrs. Whitmore, he is expecting you," she said, and led me down the short hallway into his office, where he was already standing behind his desk, glasses in hand, his expression sharper than it had been on the phone. "Eleanor," he said, gesturing for me to sit, "tell me everything." I did not waste time. I opened my purse, took out the printed listing documents, the photos on my phone, and the manila envelope with the preliminary transfer, placing them one by one on his desk in front of him. He moved through them methodically, reading, comparing, occasionally adjusting his glasses, and the room grew quieter with each page he turned. When he reached the screenshot of the email thread with Keller and Associates, he stopped, leaned closer, and read the sender address again, then looked up at me. "You are certain this is not your account?" he asked, and I met his gaze directly. "I have never seen that email address before today," I said. He nodded once, then reached for his phone and dialed a number without hesitation, placing the call on speaker. "Jason, this is Robert Halpern," he said when the line connected. "I have Mrs. Whitmore here with me, and we need to clarify something immediately." There was a brief pause, then the same voice I had heard earlier responded, cautious now. "Of course, what seems to be the issue?" Mr. Halpern tapped the printed listing lightly. "The issue is that you have a property listed under my client's name with documents that she did not authorize," he said, his tone precise, leaving no room for interpretation. There was silence on the other end for a moment, then a shift, papers moving, a keyboard clicking. "That is not what our records indicate," Jason replied. "We have signed authorization, verified through email correspondence." Mr. Halpern glanced at me briefly before continuing. "And if that email account was created without her consent?" he asked, and this time the pause was longer, more measured. "Then we would have a serious problem," Jason said finally. Mr. Halpern leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands. "You already do," he said, then reached for the notarized deed copy I had brought from the tin, placing it beside the printed transfer. "This is the current legal ownership document, and it has not been transferred," he added. There was a shift in the tone on the line, less confident now. "If that is the case," Jason said, "then the transaction cannot proceed until this is resolved." Mr. Halpern nodded once, even though the man could not see him. "It will not proceed," he said, and ended the call. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was different, not uncertain, not tense, but settled, like something had been placed exactly where it belonged. He turned back to me, tapping the stack of documents lightly. "This is attempted fraud, Eleanor," he said, his voice firm. "Forged signature, unauthorized listing, misrepresentation to a third party. And that is before we even get into the financial aspect." I listened without interrupting because I already knew what this meant, not just emotionally, but legally, structurally something that could not be brushed aside with a conversation at the dinner table. He reached for a legal pad and began writing quickly. "We are going to file an immediate notice to halt the closing, notify the realty office formally, and document everything you have brought in," he said, then looked up again, "and I strongly advise that we prepare for a direct confrontation because once this is filed, they will know exactly what you have done." I nodded once slowly. "Good," I said, because that was no longer something to avoid. He studied me for a moment, then added, "There is one more thing," he said, turning the email printout toward me again. "This recovery address tied to the Carter domain. That is your connection, but if we can confirm the device used to send these messages, we can place it directly in your home." I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, unlocking it and opening the message from Mark that had arrived just minutes earlier. "You mean like this?" I said, turning the screen toward him, the text clear and direct. "Login origin confirmed. Residential IP matches your home network. Device identified as a Dell laptop, active within the last 72 hours. Mr. Halpern read it once, then again, and let out a quiet breath. "That is exactly what I mean," he said. I placed the phone back into my purse and stood up, smoothing my coat as I did, because now there was nothing uncertain left, no assumption, no guesswork, just a chain of evidence that connected every step they had taken back to the same place. "Then I think it is time we go back and finish this," I said, and as I turned toward the door, One final realization settled into place, clear and unavoidable, because stopping the sale was only the beginning. What mattered next was how they would react when they understood that everything they had built was about to be taken apart, piece by piece. I did not wait until morning. I drove straight back home from Mr. Halpern's office with a tight grip on the steering wheel, my chest rising faster than I could steady, because now this was no longer confusion or suspicion. This was something real, documented, undeniable. And it burned. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch light was already on, casting that familiar yellow glow across the front steps. And for a second, I just sat there, breathing hard, trying to gather myself. But the moment I looked at that house, at the place they had tried to sell out from under me, something inside me broke loose. I got out of the car faster than I meant to, my door slamming harder than usual, and walked straight to the front door, unlocking it with a sharp turn of the key. The moment I stepped inside, both of them were already there in the living room, like they had been waiting. Melissa standing near the table, Daniel pacing just behind her, and the second they saw my face, they knew something had changed. "We need to talk," I said, my voice not raised, but tight, controlled in a way that made it clear this was not a discussion anymore. Melissa straightened, tried to regain her composure. "We already did," she replied, but I did not slow down. I walked straight past them and dropped my purse onto the table with a force that made the papers inside shift audibly. "No," I said, turning back to face them. "You talked. I listened. Now you're going to listen." And before either of them could respond, I pulled out the printed documents, the screenshots, the deed, and spread them across the table in one motion. Daniel stepped forward first, his eyes scanning the pages, confusion flashing into something sharper. "What is this?" he asked, and I did not hesitate. "That is proof," I said, my voice rising now despite myself. "Proof that you tried to sell my house with. A forged signature, through an email account that does not belong to me. Using documents I never agreed to." Melissa's face tightened, but she did not step back. "You are overreacting," she said quickly. "This is just a misunderstanding. Do not." I cut in, my voice breaking through hers, sharper than anything I'd said all day. "Do not stand there and call this a misunderstanding." The room fell silent for a second. Even Daniel froze, because that was not the voice they had been dealing with before. I pointed directly at the printed email chain, my hand shaking just slightly, but not enough to weaken the point. "You created a fake account in my name," I said, each word deliberate. "You signed documents that I never saw. And you took money for a house that is still legally mine." Daniel turned to Melissa then, his face draining of color. "You told me everything was handled," he said, his voice unsteady now. "You said she agreed." Melissa's control cracked just enough for something real to show through. Frustration, pressure, something close to panic. "We did what needed to be done," she snapped, because she would never have agreed otherwise. And that was it. The moment everything shifted because she had said it out loud. I let out a breath that felt like it had been building for hours, maybe longer, and shook my head slowly. "You do not get to decide what I would or would not agree to," I said, my voice still firm but now edged with something raw, something honest. "This is my home, not a problem for you to solve behind my back." Daniel ran a hand over his face, stepping back from the table. "This is not what I thought it was," he muttered, more to himself than to either of us. And I could see it. Then, the realization hitting him piece by piece, the weight of what he had allowed. Melissa, however, did not step back. She leaned forward instead, her voice lower now, but still defiant. "The deal is already in motion," she said. "You cannot just undo it because you change your mind." I let out a short, disbelieving breath, the kind that comes when something crosses a line, so clearly there is no question left. And I reached into my purse one more time, pulling out my phone and placing it on the table between us. "It is already undone," I said, and turned the screen toward them, showing the message from Mr. Halpern confirming the legal halt. The notice filed, the transaction frozen. Daniel leaned in, reading it, his shoulders dropping as the reality settled in, while Melissa stared at the screen, her jaw tightening, the confidence from earlier draining into something else entirely. I straightened, looking at both of them, my chest still tight, my hands still unsteady, but my voice clear. "You thought this was finished," I said, "but this is where it starts." And as the silence filled the room again, heavier than before, one truth settled over all of us at once. This was no longer just about stopping them. It was about what would happen next now that everything they had done was out in the open. The silence after I showed them the notice did not last long. Melissa reached for the phone, her hand quick, almost desperate, but I moved faster than she expected, not to grab it, not to stop her physically, but to place my hand firmly over the documents on the table, anchoring everything in place. "Go ahead," I said, my voice steady but charged now. "Call whoever you think can fix this." She hesitated for the first time since this began, her confidence fractured just enough to reveal what was underneath, not control, not certainty, but fear. Daniel stepped back completely, running both hands through his hair, his voice low and strained. "Melissa, what did you do?" And she turned on him sharply. "I did what you would not," she said, but the edge in her voice was no longer strength. It was pressure breaking through. I reached into my purse again and pulled out one final envelope, thicker than the others, sealed until now, and placed it in front of them. "Before I came home," I said, "Mr. Halpern filed more than a notice to stop your closing." I slid the envelope toward Daniel. "Go ahead, open it." And he did, his hands unsteady as he pulled out the papers inside, his eyes moving across the page faster with each line, then stopping completely. "Mom, this is," he began, but I finished it for him. "A formal fraud report," I said, "filed with the county and forwarded to the district attorney's office." Melissa's face went still, not composed, not controlled, but frozen, as if her mind had not caught up with the words yet. "You would not," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and I looked at her directly. "Every word clear, every word earned." "You already did," I replied. The knock at the door came less than 10 minutes later, sharp, official, not the kind of knock you mistake for a neighbor, and Daniel flinched at the sound, while Melissa stood perfectly still, as if refusing to acknowledge it might make it go away. I walked to the door myself and opened it, 2 officers standing on the porch, their presence calm but unmistakable, one of them holding a folder. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked, and I nodded, stepping slightly aside. "Yes, I am." "Eleanor Whitmore." He glanced at the paperwork, then back at me. "We are here regarding a report filed earlier this evening involving fraudulent property transfer and identity misrepresentation." I stepped back fully, allowing them into the house. "You should speak with them," I said, gesturing toward the living room. The shift in the room was immediate, absolute. Melissa's composure collapsing into something raw and unguarded as the officers approached. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to answer a few questions," one of them said. And for the first time, she did not have an answer ready, her voice faltering. "There's been a misunderstanding," she tried. But the officer's tone remained steady. "We will determine that," he replied. Daniel stood off to the side, pale, silent, watching everything unfold as if it were happening to someone else, and I could see it in his eyes, the full weight of what had been done, not just to me, but by him through his silence, as they asked Melissa to step outside. Her eyes met mine one last time, not with defiance now, but with something hollow, something that understood too late what this had cost, and I did not look away. The front door closed behind them, the sound final in a way nothing else had been all day, and the house fell quiet again. But this time it was not empty, it was reclaimed. Daniel sank into a chair, his voice barely audible. "I did not think it would go this far." And I looked at him for a long moment before answering, not gently, not harshly, just truthfully. "It went exactly as far as you allowed it to," I said. I walked back to the table, gathered the documents one by one, stacking them neatly, restoring order not just to the paper, but to everything that had been taken out of place. And when I was done, I picked up my keys from the maple leaf bowl, holding them for a moment before setting them back down where they belonged. Outside, the faint sound of a car door closing signaled the next step of consequences unfolding, but inside, the balance had already shifted completely. I turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the soft glow from the hallway, and stood there for a moment, taking in the space that was still mine, had always been mine, and would not be taken again. They had tried to pack my life into boxes, to rewrite my place in my own home, but in the end, all they managed to do was expose themselves, and I made sure the cost of that would follow them long after they walked out of my door.